So the term feminism was actually coined by a man, Charles Fourier. He's French and whatever. What does feminism mean? Very simply meaning men and women should be treated equally in society. That's it. So if men have rights, then women have rights. They have a right to vote, and women have a right to vote. Men are able to look after their own lives. Women are able to look after their own lives. So that's essentially what feminism is, okay? If we look at human beings in a state of nature, what do we find? Different animal species operate in different ways. There are some species, such as elephants and bonobos. Bonobos are one of our closest cousins. They are matriarchal societies. Matriarchy is a society run by mothers, being run by women. Patriarchy comes from the root Latin word for like father, patri, which means society run by fathers, society ruled by men. There are many like animal species that are patriarchal in nature, yeah, such as lions, or our other closest relatives, chimps. What we tend to find with these different animal species is that the species that are patriarchal, they do tend to be slightly more aggressive, like kind of like more competitive, more violent, whereas the matriarchal ones tend to be a bit more like lovey-dovey and it's a bit stereotypical and stuff, right? But this is what we tend to find with these different species. Where do human beings fit in this? It's kind of a mixture of both, although it does tend to skew a little bit more towards the patriarchal side. Within chimp society, yeah, like kind of as a comparison, there are certain roles which the males form and stuff, yeah, such as hunting, etc. Whereas the women tend to, the female chimps tend to like kind of really young and tend to forage for fruits and vegetables. In that sense, human beings in a state of nature tend to kind of follow along those lines. The way to think about it is not like a pride of lions, yeah, where you have, or like gorillas, yeah, where you have like a male at the center and like there's a harem of females, yeah, who basically kind of like he's the boss and like they're all like his mistresses. It's not exactly like that. So in chimp society, the roles are kind of as they are by default, but they're not exactly entrenched. The males tend to be more aggressive and a little bit stronger and stuff, yeah, but it still is a thing of the females are not fully subservient to the males. And human beings are quite like this as well. In hunter-gatherer societies, which is where we all started out, the males, because they tend to have a stronger upper body strength and stuff, and they tend to be able to run a bit quicker on average, typically they would be going for like hunting. And obviously like hunting, when you just got a spear and you have to run and like chase down your quarry, very, very like strenuous on the body, whereas women tended to do, yeah, like kind of gathering and stuff like fruits and roots and like nuts and everything, yeah, and also raise the children and also like do weaving, cooking and all these kind of things. People just tend to gravitate more towards what they were just naturally good at. There wasn't like a strict system that said men have to do this and women have to do that. Women societies tend to gravitate towards what they want to go towards. Now, where it starts getting complicated is to what extent do societies put up barriers saying this is a quote unquote man's job and this is a quote unquote woman's job. And this is where like when it starts getting into the role of economics or where it gets into the role of politics, this is where it starts becoming very complicated. This is where it starts becoming a thing of typically men saying, no, you as a woman cannot do that because XYZ is what a man would do and your role is this. So if women are being relegated to certain roles and being segregated from being able to access other things such as education, etc., this is where it starts becoming problematic, and this is where there is a clear need for feminism. It helps to redress these kind of gender stereotypes here, which can often act as a straitjacket. As an individual, if you want to do this and you have the capability to do that, then you should be able to do that, and no one else should be able to stop you. So when people are stopping people for completely arbitrary reasons, purely down to the sex that they were born into, that's where it becomes very problematic. As humans moved away from this kind of hunter-gatherer society, more towards like civilization as such, this is where we start to really start seeing an entrenchment of gender roles. So we start to see an entrenchment of gender roles because we have private property now. So now it ends up being a thing of, rather than men and women just belonging to like the tribe in general and just everyone just kind of getting along, it ends up becoming a thing where it's like, well, now I am the husband, this is my wife, these are my children, And so we start to have more of the development of the nuclear family, which is, it's very, very useful for like the raising of infants and stuff, in an optimal way. However, it does start to become a thing where the man ends up taking ownership of the woman. And then typically we start to see that daughters end up becoming the property of the father. So the father uses this bargaining thing. He wants to kind of have a business partnership with someone, or like if he's a king and he wants to make peace with another tribe, he'll be like, right, okay, I will give you my daughter in exchange for peace and cooperation. So women now, rather than just being relative equals, end up becoming commodities in the ownership of men. But even in these ancient times, people did start to theorize like having more equal systems. So for instance, Plato, who had many, many strange views on other topics such as endorsing slavery and all these kind of things, right? And talk about people being natural slaves. He argued that actually both men and women should be equal free citizens. Men and women should, in the ideal world, be equal. Even with regard to like going to war, every British child is taught about Boudica or Boadicea, however one wants to pronounce her name. She was the queen of the Iceni, who were a Celtic tribe. So when the Romans invaded Britain, she led a huge uprising of native people against the Romans, and it was actually quite successful. It ended up burning down Londinium, which later obviously became the city of London. The Romans eventually captured her and killed her and stuff, but it showed that actually the stereotype of women can't fight, time and time again throughout history, you find that women are often on the front lines of things, both metaphorically and in many cases physically as well. As time goes on, we start to see more and more of this kind of pushback, both among men and women, actually questioning some of the entrenchment of these roles. It didn't help as well that a lot of religions end up reinforcing kind of many of these practices, and reinforcing kind of subservient role of women. For instance, in the Bible it says things like women can't speak in church and women are this and all these kind of rules restricting women. They have to have their heads covered, like it says this in the Bible and the Quran, etc. More and more it ends up being a thing where actually on a whole societal level, multiple different powerful institutions which are now reinforcing these gender roles in a very specific and very restrictive manner. But then again, within some of these religions there was also some level of outlet. There were ways in which women could escape their traditional role of being daughters and then being passed on as wives to men that they didn't necessarily want to marry. Amongst the Tamils, the Tamil saint Andal from the 7th century, so this is in southern India. She made a divine kind of a marriage to the Hindu god Vishnu, and basically said, I don't want to marry a man, I want to be married to the Lord Vishnu. That means that I don't have to kind of go down the typical gender roles. And actually you see this again with the Catholic Church, for instance, where you had women who were nuns. They make an oath of chastity, and they make a kind of, they make a spiritual marriage in a way to Jesus and to God, right? So they say that I will never marry a man, I'm married to God in a sense. So even within these religions where there are on paper some restrictions into what women can do, there's also within those same religions, there are outlets for them to be able to kind of do their own thing. And if you live in a nunnery, women controlled kind of thing, and very independently minded, very intelligent people end up going into these nunneries. So now, skipping forward a few centuries into Renaissance Italy, we start to see the writings of prominent women such as Christie de Pizan. So in her famous book, the Book of the City of Ladies, she's the first notable feminist, as one could say, who actually lays out a critique of misogyny, which is the belief that women are inferior to men. She has a massive influence on the Italian humanist movement that was rising up in that time. And also we have Cassandra Fedra. See, my Italian pronunciation is all right. She also is very, very influential within this early humanist movement. And she becomes actually the first female to be admitted into a humanist society. Already at this quite early stage within what we consider the kind of early modern history, we start to see women actually being quite well educated and quite vocal and literate, and actually really arguing against the kind of entrenched roles that they had at that time. Now, what we have to really understand about this time is that this was in the age before mass democratic political participation. So at this early stage, they weren't really arguing for political rights as such, because only a very small handful of, like, you know, kings or whatever actually had that much power in most countries in the world. So these women were not necessarily arguing for having more say in how things were governed. They were much more interested in economic like independence, yeah, for women. So, for instance, like wives having the power to go out and buy things like without needing the express permission of their husband, be able to travel, be able to do all these different things. And, you know, like, say for instance, if the husband died, right, so for the woman actually to be able to inherit the house rather than just being kind of like left destitute, giving women like more of a chance for education, more of a chance for if they wanted to go into some sort of like work, for the right to be able to do that. So this is more of the focus on this kind of early feminism. But, you know, there were quite a lot of men who were actually quite supportive of like women's rights in these realms. However, as time goes on, we start to see with like the rise of democratic participation, we start to have a bit of a clash, right? By the time it gets to the Enlightenment period, you'd have men who will take very strong stances on a whole lot of different issues, but suddenly when it comes to the role of women having a say in society and like the rights of women, it ends up being a thing where it's like, you know, we're happy for them to run their own affairs in life here, but we don't want them having a say in like current affairs, like in terms of national affairs and stuff. I mean, that's a step too far. Even the ones who might have believed in such things, they wouldn't have wanted to publicly come out and say it because of the kind of public scandal for it. It's quite ironic that by about the 1500s or 1600s, yeah, you have a list of countries, yeah, and I'll read out the list of countries which already had queens, yeah, like queen regant. These are women who weren't just like the husband of the king, right, and just were given the title of queen. These are people who are queens in their own right, like they're actually rulers of the country, right? So, ancient Egypt, Madagascar, Mexico, China, Japan, India, Vietnam, Cambodia, Iran, Iraq, Israel, even Saudi Arabia, yeah. So obviously these kingdoms were not called that at the time, but it was a thing, you know, within these modern day countries, there's a history of women ruling these places. Never mind in Poland, you had it in Denmark, Hungary, Italy, and of course England. By like the 1800s, you know, you had women like ruling in Russia, you had women ruling all over the world. Even in some places in Africa, women were the queens. So this idea of women shouldn't have a say in the current affairs of the country, but at the same time you're going to be happy to be ruled by a queen, it doesn't really make a whole heap of sense to us like in the modern era. Maybe the argument is, well, it's bad enough we've got one woman ruling us without all the others getting involved as well. But it's just it's quite strange, because if you think about Queen Elizabeth of England, for instance, leading the country for 45 years, led the country against that kind of the invasion of the Spanish Armada, and you know, and the famous quote that she had, where she's speaking to the troops of like, I may have the frail body of a woman, but I have the stomach and something of a man. Yeah, so basically she's saying, I may look weak, but I'm actually tough, right? So time and time again, we actually do see women in positions of powers clearly showing that they're capable, or even in some cases more capable than their male counterparts. You know, Catherine the Great of Russia, like multiple different women, right? In both cases, yeah, like kind of like Catherine the Great was able to do whatever she wanted within her private life. Elizabeth I, like famously said that she's married to the nation. Yeah, she was the Virgin Queen, like the U.S. state of Virginia is named after her, you know, in honor to the Virgin Queen. This idea of women, if they happen to be the eldest daughter of the current king, they could then like rule, but everyone else in society was like, yeah, about that. It's quite a lot of hypocrisy, and women started to, and men and women really started to notice this the more that time went on, and the more that attitudes kind of changed into the rights of man. So if men have got rights, then why can't women have rights as well? Starting to get into the modern era a little bit more now, And you start seeing, for instance, Quakers, which is a Protestant denomination, being the first ones to allow women to actually speak in church, right? So again, in a society that was very orientated around religion, this was like the first time that women would have like a public platform to like get up and speak on matters within their own rights. By the time it gets to the Enlightenment period, we have prominent men advocating for it, such as Jeremy Bentham and famously Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine, who we've mentioned before, writing like many things, but especially in this context, the rights of man. Now, a year later, Mary Wollstonecraft, yeah, right? Wollstonecraft. I need to check how I pronounce things right. She writes a rebuttal to the rights of man, which is the vindication of the rights of women. So she makes the argument of, hold on, right, so Thomas Paine, you're writing about the rights of man, you're saying that, and this is the same man who, as we discussed earlier in previous videos, this is someone who in late 18th century is arguing for the abolition of monarchy. He's advocating against Christianity and organised religion. British citizen arguing for American independence from the British Empire, and many other causes. Arguing for a welfare state at a time when there wasn't even any concept of this. Arguing for things which were like at least 100, maybe even 200 years ahead of his time. But when it comes to rights for women, he's don't want to say too much on that. It might be a bit embarrassing. So for some reason, all those things are fine, but equal rights for women, that's a step too far. That's a little bit beyond on the pale. Mary Wollstonecraft making these points that actually you can't argue for the rights of men and then leave out women, who of course make up half the population. None of us are free unless all of us are free, right? There's no point in having half the population being completely disenfranchised, purely because of accident of birth. And as the 19th century goes on, we start to see more and more of this kind of groundswell of support within Western countries in particular, giving of rights like to women, for the freeing of women. Well, I suppose you could say emancipation in a sense, the freeing of women from this kind of societal constraints. Within the realm of science, right, we start seeing people like Florence Nightingale and Mary Seacole, who are really pioneering in the field of nursing. Mary Curie did exceptional amount of work with regard to radiation. Is one of the kind of like the main people when looking into like kind of the realm of nuclear physics. Incredibly intelligent women, really showing that actually a lot of the kind of stereotypes of women of they like it's not a woman's place to be doing these things, not a woman's place to know that, etc. All these start to kind of be chipped away bit by bit. And actually there was a very famous case called the Ilbert Bill, the Ilbert Bill controversy in 1883. The British colonial administrators in India, they passed a bill which would have restricted the educational opportunities of women in India and all across the empire in general. Something which the Bengali women took great pride in pointing out is this: there are more female university level graduates in Bengal than there were in the whole of Britain. The colonised, their women being far more educated. You can imagine that in late Victorian society, this irked a lot of people to no end. It really did kind of show that actually societies which prided themselves on being so progressive and so enlightened and bringing like kind of civilization to lesser peoples, somehow they were far ahead of them on important issues such as this. So now in the late Victorian era, right, we start to see the rise of democracy. And as with anything, right, start having the rise of democracy where men are able to get more say, rather than it just being a tiny elite of like land-owning men. It starts becoming a thing of actually gets broadened out to the middle classes and eventually working classes. But people go, hold on, how comes half the population still does not have the right to vote? And so this is where we have the first wave of feminism, which really focused on women's suffrage. Votes for women ends up becoming a very powerful movement, especially in many English-speaking like kind of places around the world. And notably, it actually starts off in the colonies and at the outer frontier like spaces, yeah, like kind of the English speaking world. New Zealand, in 1893, I believe, ends up being the first country which actually gives women like the right to vote. Many Western states in America, Australia, Canada, many of these different places, yeah, end up getting the right to vote for women far before you start seeing it on the east coast of America or in Britain, where society like kind of is more entrenched. Because out on the frontiers are mainly occupied by men, right? Most of the pioneers are men. If you watch any cowboy film, you see that women, other than like prostitutes or whatever, like kind of have a very, very like kind of like they're almost like non-existent in many of these things, yeah. And that's a relatively accurate depiction of things, yeah, like and in those early stages. What one tended to find is that when there were women, they had the pick of the litter. They could like they weren't with their husband. They weren't with their fathers in many cases. Yeah, they themselves were looking for a life out west as well. They had a lot more freedom than people would have had like back home, where they could just be like, well, actually, I'm one woman and there's probably about 5 men to me at least, yeah, right? So I can actually have a say. I don't have to ask for my father's permission. I can have a say in any of these men who I want to actually marry and stuff. Women out there had a lot more independence, had a lot more economic power, had a lot more say in how things were run and stuff. Bit by bit, it ends up being a thing where the rights of women to vote in these places ends up becoming just a thing, right? And slowly it goes from the peripheries back to the core. In Britain and America, it took until after World War One for women to finally be given the vote. So in Britain in 1918, so in the same year that working class men were able to get the vote, middle class women who were married and above the age of 30 were given the right to vote. And then by 1928, it ends up being a thing of actually men and women finally have the right to vote, like on equal terms. And then in 1920, the federal kind of like constitutional amendment, the 19th Amendment, ends up getting passed, and this guarantees rights for women to vote in all states in America. But interestingly, in many places, women didn't get the right to vote at the same time. So, for instance, France, it took until the liberation of France from Nazi occupation in 1944 for women to be given the right to vote at any level, even local, right? Which is, in most cases, like kind of like the right of women to have local, to be able to participate in local democracy was still allowed. But 1944 for women in France to have any rights at all. Switzerland didn't have the right to vote for women until 1971. Right, and this is in a country which really prides itself and has done for centuries, yeah, in having direct democracy. Never mind many other places around the world. Throughout the 20th century, it took many like decades, yeah, for women to be given suffrage all around the world for it to be the norm. And as late as 2015, Saudi Arabia now allows women to vote. Obviously, there's not a national election because it's still absolute monarchy, but they can now vote in local elections. So it's taken a long time. It's taken over a century for women from when the suffrage movement began to like its final conclusion, but at least it's made some progress.